person. So hello everyone and good afternoon. And welcome to, we're very excited about this guest lecture to be delivered by our distinguished guest, Dr. Oboler, on the topic of online hate speech. So I'd like to welcome you both on behalf of myself. My name is Kenneth Brad. I'm assistant professor here at the Faculty of Law and lead jurist of the Winograd Initiative. And Laurel Harris KC, who is curriculum lead for the Professionalism, Advocacy, and Anti-Racism. So this lecture is being hosted by the University of Manitoba Faculty of Law and the Winograd Initiative, with many, many thanks to Chuck and Libby Winograd for generous funding for the Winograd Initiative and to support our research into hate speech among other issues. This is the first lecture in really what we hope to be a planned lecture series under the auspices of the Winograd Initiative dedicated to hate speech, anti-Semitism, and related topics. Before introducing Dr. Oboler, I would like to begin with the land acknowledgements. The University of Manitoba campuses and research spaces are located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Ininawak, Anisininawak, Dakota, Oyate, Dene, Inuit, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. The University of Manitoba recognizes that the treaties signed on these lands are a lifelong, enduring relationship, and we are dedicated to upholding their spirit and intent. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and the present, and with this understanding, we commit to supporting Indigenous excellence through active reconciliation, meaningful change, and the creation of an environment where everyone can thrive. Our collaboration with Indigenous communities is grounded in respect and reciprocity, and this guides how we move forward as an institution. And so I think it's important in that regard to acknowledge that these harms, which I've just referred to, are really ongoing harms. And in fact, in that vein, I also would like to note that today, actually January 29th, is the 9th anniversary of the tragic killing of 6 people and the injury of many others at a Quebec City mosque on January 29th, 2017. And so I think it's important to acknowledge these harms, and that both physical and psychological and other harms are ongoing, and that technology has played and continues to play a role in perpetuating these harms. And technology as well could be part of the solution to these ongoing harms and promote reconciliation, as well as intercommunal and interfaith dialogue. With this in mind, I would like to introduce Dr. Oboler, who has joined us all the way from Australia to speak about online hate speech and its disturbing rise in recent years, including impacts on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Dr. Oboler is an adjunct associate professor in the law school at La Trobe University and CEO of the Online Hate Prevention Institute, an Australian charity that tackles all forms of online hate and extremism. For the last 2 years, he has served as the chair of the committee responsible for global policy at the IEED, the world's largest professional body dedicated to advancing technology for humanity. Dr. Oboler has served as an invited speaker for the UN Forum on Minority Issues, the G20 Interfaith Forum, and as an advisor for a number of national governments. He's been an expert witness in a number of recent court cases related to hate speech and extremism. He holds a PhD in computer science from Lancaster University and an LLM Juris Doctor from Monash University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Oboler.
I'll specify that it's Lancaster University, UK, because I was about to go from Australia and familiarise myself with the map of the campus, only to realise there were 2 Lancaster universities and I'd been looking at the wrong one. So I'm actually going to come back to, well, here we go. I'm actually going to come back to Lancaster University in my introduction. Do forgive me, I'm going to go a little bit quickly through some of the early slides because I've added a lot of background here for you, just so you know where I'm coming from and how I get to where I am right now, because I think that's important context. So we'll do that introduction, then look at some of the early work of the Online Hate Prevention Institute, again, just to give you a bit of background, Then we're going to dive into online hate after the October 7 terrorist attack in Israel and the start of the war in Gaza. And we're going to look at both the anti-Semitism and the Islamophobia, really from a sample of data that was collected in November 2023 through to the end of February 2024. So 3 months very shortly after the attack and the start of the war. After that, and this was not in the program because we set the topic before 15 people were killed in a terrorist attack in Australia. I'm going to share a little bit of the latest data we've got, which was literally published a couple of weeks ago. And we publish quickly. This is content from a terrorist attack that happened a little over a month ago now. And then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. So with that, one more piece of housekeeping. There is hate speech here. There is a little bit of content related to terrorist material. If anyone does feel unduly uncomfortable, if you need to leave, please do so. If you need to get help, these are your university's counselling services up here. They are available. If someone does need to leave at any point, I'm not going to be offended. No one else is going to be offended. Look after yourself first. Okay, I have a team of 11 people that are spending sometimes more than 12 hours a day looking at this sort of content. If we don't look after our staff, if we don't look after the people doing the work doesn't happen. So make sure you look after yourself as well here. Okay, an introduction. So I moved from Australia to the UK to start my PhD. I went there because the top professor in computer science in my field had agreed to supervise me. So I just went where he was. My very first day, I had an anti-Semitic incident travelling on a public bus from the university into town. And I couldn't for the life of me work out how, it was an older gentleman shouting anti-Semitic abuse at me on a public bus. And I had no idea how he even worked out I was Jewish. Then I realised, sort of a day later, that I'd signed up to the Jewish Student Society on campus, and they'd given me like a show bag with a giant Magen David on it that I was just carrying with me as I went into town. And again, coming from Australia, where up until fairly recently, we didn't have these issues, this was not something I thought about. So that was my first experience. After that, I ended up getting involved in the student union, in student politics. That's a whole nother story to do with a public-private partnership in a construction company that was not looking after our student residences correctly, and I spoke too much in a meeting and someone put me on a committee, and that's how I ended up involved in all of that. I ended up as an officer in the student union, and I was finding that there were anti-Semitic speeches being made and flyers distributed on campus that were literally printouts of things off the internet. And I'm including things up to and including Holocaust denial, like obvious things. And people didn't understand it. They did their own research online. They ended up on sites that were highly problematic, made printouts, and this was a problem. This was the bad side. On the good side, what you're seeing in the image there is the chaplaincy centre at Lancaster University. It was one of the first buildings built on the campus and is actually the university's logo. It's based on that design of that building. The chaplaincy centre was the first purpose-built multi-faith chaplaincy centre in the UK, and it had 2 different churches, a synagogue and spaces used for other religions as well. And there was a committee that looked after the building, the centre, interfaith activities, and they ran something called Faith Share, where once a month representatives of all the different faiths would come together and they'd pick a topic, what's the role of fasting in your religion, what's the significance of special places, whatever it was, how do you deal with death, and everyone would share a perspective from their religion, but personal sort of perspective as well. One of my colleagues and friends there was the Muslim representative who participated in this faith share. I would often represent the Jewish community, he would represent the Muslim community. One of the things, and I'll come back to him in a minute, but one of the things that happened when I was there is I was also responsible for the religious student clubs for all the different faiths. I was the student union's representative dealing with them. And the university decided to demolish the mosque. They were doing massive renovations on campus and that building had to go. So as the president of the Jewish Student Society, because of this other role I had, I ended up being the person negotiating with the university on having a temporary mosque put in place and dealing with all the issues that they didn't get right to ensure that it could actually function as the Muslim students needed. So, you know, the temporary mosque eventually was put up and the go-ahead was given to demolish the old one. I was invited to the opening of this temporary mosque set up in some porta cabins. Invited by the committee, went along, they put a seat out for me at the side there while they were doing prayers, and then there was a meal. I had one first-year Muslim student who had just arrived, who knew none of the background on any of this, who came up to me when we were having a meal saying, I saw you were sitting there at the back, are you there for like the government to watch us? But this shows the sort of concern and, you know, the lived reality of persecution that people are living with. So I give this as background. I had some other roles while I was there. I ended up National Secretary of the Union of Jewish Students in the UK. I was on the National Postgraduate Committee, which is the union for postgrad students. And then I ended up also sitting on the board of directors of the QAA, which is the Quango quasi-government organisation that regulates the universities and actually has the right to stop them awarding degrees. I was the one student for the whole of the UK that sat with that board. So I had all those positions at the same time as I was dealing with this mosque issue, which meant when I spoke to the university administration and said, you need to fix this, you know, they listened. So that's a little bit of background. That would have been up until 2007. 2008, I did a postdoc in Israel in political science, and I published a paper looking at what I called Antisemitism 2.0. This was anti-Semitism in social media and talking about the way it was normalising hate in society. Around this time, I think at this point, Facebook had either just passed MySpace or was about to. So in internet terms, this is how long ago this is. Hands up if you know what MySpace even is. Okay. Okay, so this is internet history. This paper was pre-released at something called the Global Forum to Combat Anti-Semitism. This was something convened by the Israeli government with experts, academics, civil society organisations, diplomats from around the world. So I ended up on a panel, partly because of this paper, partly because it looked good to have a young person on the panel and I was still a young person at that point. So I presented this and we pre-released the paper at the conference and it became one of the major topics of discussion at this international forum. The following year, the Israeli government asked if I would serve as a co-chair of a working group on internet and media anti-Semitism. So the Global Forum was a government paid for program supported by the Foreign Ministry, but the steering committee was made up of independent experts, academics, civil society people from around the world. So myself and David Mattis, who's actually a lawyer here in Winnipeg, a human rights lawyer, we were the two people that for 10 years chaired this working group on internet and media anti-Semitism. And we did more work than any of the other working groups. There are about 12 of them. What you're seeing, all that really small text, we put out a report from the 2009 meeting, a report that looked at all the issues relating to online anti-Semitism. And many of these issues really, anti-Semitism was just, an example of the problem. The actual issues were to do with technology and hate and how it wasn't being addressed. And you could slot out anti-Semitism and slot in any other form of hate, and the issues would be exactly the same. The problem was, at this point, no other form of racism or hate was actually even on the radar, right? This one was only on the radar because there was a government standing behind it saying, we need to do something about this. The picture down the bottom, anyone recognise who's in the picture?
One on the left.
Yeah?
Erwin Kotler.
Yeah, so the one on the left is Erwin Kotler, Professor Kotler, one of your top law professors, or emeritus now, and former Attorney General of Canada. The person on his other side is Natan Sharansky. Natan Sharansky was one of the refuseniks in Russia who was sent to the gulags for running a human rights organisation. And there was a massive, if you've heard of the campaign to free Soviet Jewry, he was one of the sort of poster people that they were trying to get free. So two, really top figures also involved in running this forum. Just to give you an example of the work that the working group we were running did, what you're looking at is a letter dated from 2011 from Richard Allen, Lord Richard Allen, who was the Director of Public Policy for what's now Meta and was then Facebook. This entire long letter is justifying why Facebook thinks Holocaust denial is okay to have on their platform and they will not be removing it. And I'll just read the bit I've enlarged here. We've come to the conclusion that the mere statement of denying the Holocaust is not a violation of our policies. We recognise people's right to be factually wrong about historical events. Right, we've just had Holocaust Memorial Day. This is no longer Facebook's policy now. But the fact that we got a letter addressed to us after actually having, Zoom didn't exist in those days. I think it was a Skype call we had with him, with a meeting of global representatives and actually having Facebook be accountable to say, we all agree this is a major problem, what are you doing about it? It took another sort of 10 years before we finally got this one fixed. And then, of course, all sorts of other organisations claimed the credit. So I was doing this work, the Global Forum stuff was entirely voluntary. I was running a project in Australia dealing specifically with anti-Semitism. That was in 2010 and 2011. Again, most of what we were dealing with, although we were looking at anti-Semitism, the issues really affected all sorts of groups, and not just religious and racial minorities, but disabilities as well, women as well, LGBTIQ plus communities. Also, a really large segment of society was being negatively impacted by these issues. And after 2 years running this project on anti-Semitism, we decided that it would be far better if we close the project, spin it out, and start up a new organisation covering all forms of online hate. So that's where the Online Hate Prevention Institute came from. So established in January 2012, which means we've just turned 14, designed to be a world leader combating online hate and a critical partner that works with key stakeholders to improve the prevention, mitigation and responses to online hate and extremism. Okay, and I'm not going to read the second paragraph there, but what we try and do is cause systemic change. Our view is that it is not the job of either civil society or government to be running around after social media companies picking up all the litter that they've left behind. Okay, if we did that with environmental protection, if we said companies have no responsibility and the government's going to provide you all the protections you need and come and clean up all your rubbish for you and the taxpayer will pay for all of it, the companies would do a lot better, society would do a lot worse. So this is the analogy we look at. Did I skip one? No. Okay. These are some of the key types of hate that we deal with. There are many others. These are ones that just keep reoccurring. Okay. So how do we do this? What we're trying to do is get a real-time understanding of online hate and extremism. By real-time, I mean we're not going to wait 12 months to get a paper published in a journal. If there's a problem, we need to know about it now. Okay, if there's a problem that's going viral, I literally have mobile phone numbers for people at Meta, Google, etc., that we can pick up the phone, disrupt someone, middle of the night if need be, to say, you have a major problem on your hands. Okay, obviously you can't do that too often. They'll change their number. But we do it. So we mitigate the risk by securing content removal. We do that when we see stuff. Meta's very unhappy with me at the moment because after the terrorist attack, we gathered the data. We always report it as we collect it. And then we sat on it for a month to finish our report before we actually gave them the list of URLs so that they can respond to it. They would much rather we didn't test their system and just gave them the URLs up front. But in order to get systemic change, we need their system to be effective, not just when we tell them there's a problem, but when anybody tells them there's a problem. And we need to measure what the gap is between what the public's telling them and what they're doing, and not just the special treatment we can get when we go directly to staff. We champion change to the technology, policies and laws, provide expertise to the platforms, intergovernment bodies, governments, organisations, civil society. We deconstruct hate messages, so we publish a lot of articles where we show the hate and then we explain what it's saying and why it's a problem. And that's done so other people can learn from what we've said, and they can use that to push back with counter speech. We support public education through our publications, through talks like this, and we provide expert legal advice very often to the police as well as to some private cases in the hate speech area. So just while I've been in Canada the last few days, we've got one on Nazi tattoos that the police have asked us for help on. People ask, well, how do you prove you're having an impact? That is a really tough question. I outsourced the problem. I went back to Meta and said, we're doing a whole lot of stuff to help you. Could you give us a letter telling us how what we do actually helps? This is a letter from a vice president of Meta. I've highlighted some bits in yellow there, talking about the high quality of our analysis and advice, the close cooperation across industry, civil society and government, talking about identifying hateful content on their services and how they use the data we give them to improve their policies, products and partnerships. So, you can report stuff. The impact we're talking about here is real impact. Okay, it's not just we put something into the system and we think we have. This is actually the company saying what you're doing changes what we do. So, some of the early work, one of the first things we did was a report looking at anti-Indigenous racism. We had memes, racist memes going viral in Australia, a small group of people producing many Facebook pages promoting them. So that was 2012. 2013, we produced the world's first report on online Islamophobia. No one had actually done this before. I'll talk about this one in a bit more detail. Also in 2013, we used a very similar approach to do one on anti-Semitism. Both of these reports, and I'll come to it in a minute, we looked at pages that were dedicated to hate, and we made a list of the pages, and we made lists of the content on those pages that was unlawful, proving that each page had at least, I think it was either 3 or 5 items, and we said, well, this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is showing that there's much more, and therefore this page should be sanctioned and removed. And then we followed up to see, after we tell the platform about it, have they removed it? 2015, the terrorist attack on Charlie Hebdo, we produced a report looking at where the line was between freedom of speech and hate speech. The Charlie Hebdo attack related to cartoons they'd made of the Prophet Muhammad. This goes back to the Danish cartoon issues. So we started looking at, okay, well, when do things cross the line? And we came up with a rationale that said some of the cartoons of Muhammad that were being circulated were hate speech. And they were hate speech because Muhammad was being used as a symbol to represent either all Muslims or any Muslim. So Muhammad was the proxy for Muslims. There was one cartoon with Muhammad with a turban with a bomb. We said, well, that's hate speech. There's other examples where if it's a cartoon of Muhammad where Muhammad is only representing himself, then you're moving into the territory of blasphemy. And in Australia, we've had a case to do with, it was a Christian-related case where the court decided blasphemy laws that had been on the books for 100 and something years had never been used and therefore were no longer good law. So blasphemy in Australia is not unlawful, but hate speech attacking a group is. So different laws depending on where you are, but there is a distinction on what we're actually talking about. So diving into the 2013 report, we examined 50 different anti-Muslim Facebook pages. We gathered 349 images across these pages. We grouped the images and we found there were 191 unique images. Now, there were some that were slight variations, but we said, well, that's close enough. It's the same thing. It's just been redrawn or whatever. We put them together. So 191 unique ones. And we then sorted them into themes. When I say we sorted, we literally printed off, I forget if it was the 191 or the 349. It was a large pile of paper. We printed them off and we scattered them across the floor. And then we sat there saying, well, here's one item. We put it here in a neat pile. Here's another one. Does this belong in that pile or do we need to start a new pile? And we made all these piles. And then we looked at them and said, can this pile and this pile, are they close enough? Can we merge them and make a more general heading for them? So that's how we sorted them physically. And that gave us our categories of Islamophobia, which I'll bring up in a second. We also published in the report all 191 representative images and the ID numbers for every single one of the copies of that image. I know there aren't mics there, but someone want to tell me why we would do this? No? Okay, those ID numbers, this is all on Facebook. Those ID numbers can be used by Facebook to find the item. Okay, they're a unique identifier, right? The same way a mobile phone number can be traced to a person. These identifiers trace to each copy of this item. By giving the numbers publicly, the company and someone with enough technical knowledge is able to jump to each of those images. Firstly, to then deal with them, to remove them, but also on the other side to check if they're still online. So we're able to now make this auditable, to check whether there's been appropriate action and was it only on the example, the exact example shown, or did they clean up all the other copies of it? So this is what we're bringing the sort of computer science side of this to the work, which is really moving into the human rights and legal aspect. But it's this sort of approach and work which allows for regulation to actually work, because you can't have regulation if you can't measure and enforce it. These are the categories we had, and we're still using these categories today with one small change. So Muslims as a security threat, a threat to public safety, we had 42 examples of that. 42 very different examples again. These are from the unique set, not the individual items. Muslims as a cultural threat, 29 were in that category. Muslims as an economic threat, 11 examples. Dehumanizing or demonizing Muslims, 37 examples. 24 examples of threats of violence or genocide directed at Muslims. 12 examples of hate against refugees or asylum seekers. 36 examples of other forms of anti-Muslim hate. And that's the one we've actually changed because we went back and we found that some of the things within others we could actually make more unique categories on. So I think we've got 1 or 2 extra categories from that. This work, the report was published, and a few years later it was updated and put out in a chapter in a book. I believe this was the first book looking at online Islamophobia as well. The report, by the way, was a 2-page summary, was included in the observatory report for the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation. So this was a report that went to the foreign ministers of every Muslim country. Right? Now, what I haven't told you is the organisation that the project was running in for 2 years before we spun out was the Zionist Federation of Australia. And that was on our website. Right? The fact that this work was so important and no one else had done it, meant the fact that there was a Zionist association with where the organisation had come from was completely irrelevant. The important part was that the Islamophobia was being addressed. We did a report on anti-Semitism around the same time. What's different in this report, in fact, no, this is 2015. You'll see another one, an updated Islamophobia one in a second. 2015, we built software to do crowd gathering of data. So we had, the number's not there, but it's a large sample of anti-Semitism data, divided up into different categories. 4 main categories, one of which is traditional anti-Semitism. That's the largest, almost half of all the data. And we can talk about what that is. But that's the sort of anti-Semitism we had prior to World War II, really. And also some of the Nazi-related sort of stuff, the racist anti-Semitism. Israel-related anti-Semitism, what's known as new anti-Semitism, that's a category of anti-Semitism, saying Israel has no right to exist, applying double standards. There's a list of things that fall in that category. Nazi analogies to Israel all fit within that. Holocaust-related content, and then we have a small slice that is related to violence. Anyone want to tell me why we separate the violence out? It's incitement to violence. Yeah?
It's actually a crime,
Yes.
Is criminal activity that you can demonstrate.
It's criminal activity, it's serious, it needs to be treated with priority, okay? Because that could actually lead to physical injury to people or worse. And then we traced how many of the items we gathered had been removed after we reported them. And the response was absolutely shocking. In the best case, content inciting violence on Facebook, after 3 months, they'd removed 75% of what we'd told them about, which is saying that 25% was still there. Okay, and in other categories, it got as low as 9% being removed. Okay, so traditional anti-Semitism on YouTube, 91% remained after 3 months. At the same time, we ran something, or not quite the same time, the same year, we ran something called the SAMI Project, Spotlight on Muslim internet hate. And we used the categories from 2013. We used public reporting. We did it in partnership with the peak community body for the Muslim community in the state where we were based. We had some support from the federal police. I believe they gave us $500. That was the most they were allowed to give us without it becoming requiring much higher levels of approval and becoming a problem. But we wanted their support, so we took the $500. Next thing I know, I have the logo police on the line. The police literally has a department of the police to police the use of their logo. And apparently we had a contract signed with them that required us to use their logo, but we hadn't signed the form giving us permission to use their logo. So we had to spend a day talking to the police to sort this out. That happened because some neo-Nazis complained that they saw us using the police logo and complained on the police's social media page, and that triggered whatever happened inside the police. Just an aside. Tell Mama is an organisation in the UK that deals with Islamophobia, so we had international expert partners as well. FECA is the Australian peak community body for all ethnic community bodies. So it's sort of the peak body of the peak bodies. So really strong support on this. And I won't go through the whole breakdown again, but we had the breakdown. Just to highlight what dealing with all forms of online hate means, when COVID happened, we were approached, could we do anti-Asian hate? And we were able to use the methodology we already had well established to deal with the anti-Asian hate during COVID. And you can see again, this one was actually funded by Meta. We had the government's Human Rights Agency as a partner, and then various stakeholder groups from within the impacted communities. Okay, how am I doing for time?
You have 23 minutes.
Okay, great. So responding to October 7 and the resulting war in Gaza. I want to backtrack to just before the war. So again, one of the reasons there is so much focus on online anti-Semitism, one is because it is very big. The other is because there is the infrastructure there to respond to it. So I was actually in the European Parliament in June 2022. Sorry, 2023, 22 was still COVID. I was in Russia then, that's a whole nother story. 2 weeks before they invaded Ukraine. In the European Parliament, there was a hearing of an interparliamentary task force dealing with anti-Semitism online. So this has members of different parliaments around the world. They had a hearing, they had one in Washington, DC, and then one in the European Parliament, and the tech companies basically were put on a stand and asked questions. So for Canada, Anthony Housefather was the lead MP on that. And in the European Parliament, they also had experts testify. So we gave evidence, and then we were sitting there with WhatsApp and mobile phone numbers for the members of Parliament so that we could send them feedback while the hearing was in progress to make sure they were asking the right questions and weren't being misled or deceived by the answers from the tech companies, who also didn't necessarily know what they were saying, because who is it who comes to a hearing? It's not the engineers, it's not the people that actually run trust and safety, it's the lawyers. So the lawyers just repeat whatever they've been told is the answer. Whether or not it's actually correct is another story, right? So we had civil society expertise in the room helping. The person next to me is Eliyahu Roth. We were testifying together and we said we should do something together at some point. He runs a European-based organisation in the same space. After October 7, we got in touch and we said it's really important we deal with both the anti-Semitism and the Islamophobia, and we do so urgently. So we set up a project, it was called the Moment Project, tackling a moment of hate, and we honestly thought that this would be a spike and then it would go away. That's why it was given that name. We planned to gather data for 3 weeks, and very quickly we extended that to 3 months. And then we produced reports, talks, we ran training for public prosecutors, for police around the world. That bottom picture is the police headquarters in Brussels. We ran an online session, but out of the police headquarters with some local participants, including the chief of police popped in for a bit. Really giving people understanding on what the hate is, because you can't apply the law if you can't recognise the hate. These are the 2 reports we produced, both public and freely available. What we actually did was we collected 160 hours of monitoring on anti-Semitism and 160 hours on Islamophobia, 10 different social media platforms. The 160 hours is literally 16 hours on each platform for each of those 2 types of hate. And the reason this is so structured is because that then allows us to compare between different types of hate, between different platforms, and between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So we can actually look at dehumanisation, like if you go really deep, you can say how much dehumanisation against Muslims on TikTok was there, and how much dehumanization against Jews on TikTok was there, right? Or even compare, anti-Muslim, Muslims are terrorists sort of content. Let's compare that on Facebook on the one hand and on Instagram on the other, owned by the same company, operating under the same rules, under the same community standards. There shouldn't be a huge difference, but there is. I won't go through this in detail. This is the methodology, and this is more on the methodology. If you want to know, we can come back in questions. The point is that it is systematic and consistent. These are the categories of anti-Semitism and the categories of Islamophobia. The Islamophobia categories you have already seen, because those are the same categories we've been using since 2013, with some slight updates. The categories of anti-Semitism come from the two working definitions from IRA that are relevant. IRA actually has three. The working definition on anti-Semitism and the working definition on Holocaust denial and distortion. And that list, and it is incredibly small, I realise that, that list is drawn not just from the listed examples, but from the entire text. And that list was created by the Australian government-appointed experts to IRA during an IRA meeting. I think it was in Rome, and we then shared it back with the other expert delegates. So what we found at a very high level, the anti-Semitism was 2.4 times higher than the Islamophobia, but both of them had increased substantially from what they were at prior to October 2023. The level of hate on different platforms was very different. Okay, so you can't really even talk about online hate. You have to talk about online hate on whichever platform. We found examples of hate created using generative AI, and this is a few years ago now, so already it was starting to have an impact. We found most of the reported hate was not being removed. This shows you the level of hate. We don't have a sample of Islamophobia from before October 2023, but we happen to have just completed 12 months worth of monitoring on anti-Semitism. And we were doing that because although it looks like it's a baseline, the blue is actually already an elevated baseline because it was up because of COVID. So that's why we were measuring it, but that's now our baseline. You can see the orange is the anti-Semitism and the green is the Islamophobia. We don't know what the Islamophobia was at before October 2023, but we do know it was lower than where the anti-Semitism was at that point, like significantly lower. So the fact it was now higher shows that there was a massive increase in Islamophobia as well. Then we can break it down by platform. Remember I said it's different levels. So just to point out that the scale on these two graphs is different and the order of the platforms is different because they're arranged from highest to lowest. But you can see that Gab, Telegram are platforms usually used by the far right, as well as X, are actually in the top three platforms for both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So there's a common problem there to address. X, at least at this point in time, it may or may not be different now, X was behaving much more like a far right platform than it was behaving like the other mainstream platforms. That's what the data shows. This is the raw data, the number of items for each platform. And the percentage shows you of all the Islamophobic content and then all the anti-Semitic content, what percent was on each platform. Now, if the platforms were all dealing with the problem at the same level, then with 10 platforms, each of these should be at 10%. The fact that they're not, that some of the burden is shifted to other platforms, the fact that 23% of all of the Islamophobia was on X, this signals a really big problem.
Is this before Elon had bought it, or is this, do you know the chronology?
I have to double check. I think it's around then. Yeah. Again, for time, I'll skip over some of this. This is just some analysis of what it means. I believe you'll have the slides, so you can go through that. Removal rates, still very bad. Years later, we've been monitoring this for some time. Still very bad. The colour coding, we marked the top few platforms in green, and we marked the bottom few performing platforms in orange for each type of hate. There's only one platform, which was TikTok, which was in the top performing platforms for removing one type of hate and the bottom performing platforms for removing another type. Right? That is a representation of bias in the platform. Every other platform, they're either equally good or equally bad. So people reflect on their own experience, and they would say, well, the platform is really bad at removing the hate that attacks me or my community. That may be true, but that doesn't mean they're not equally bad for everybody else. Okay, so that itself doesn't necessarily represent bias at the platform end. Okay, but in this case, we did find one platform with a bias. So just to pull out a recommendation from that, this work demonstrated the need for ongoing research to continuously gather the data to see how it was changing, and to be able to work out where we need to focus our attention from that. I mentioned we can go deeper. This is now the anti-Muslim hate from that period, now divided out by both platform and the hate narrative. So we can now start seeing that the different narratives are at different levels on different platforms. Just to pull up one major difference, so anti-Muslim jokes are common on Facebook, Instagram and X, but they're almost totally absent when it comes to TikTok and LinkedIn. Right? And I would say that's not that users don't try and share them there. There's a little bit of that impact, but there's also the platform's own response saying this is inappropriate, we don't allow this, whereas another platform might say, well, we have an exception for humour. And I have some examples here of the Islamophobia. When we first spoke about this talk, I thought I'd be showing you far more examples and far fewer graphs. I apologise if that was your expectation, but here we have some of our examples. This is representing Muslims as a cultural threat. That's one of our categories. So you can see Melbourne has lost its identity because there's Muslims praying in a public park. Islam destroys culture, period, etc. This is the sort of content we're looking at. The dehumanisation, literally you can see human scum here. Animals don't do this kind of stuff. This is what we're talking about when we talk about dehumanising Muslims, demonising Muslims. The big category right now, and always after any sort of terrorist event, is Muslims as a security threat. And that can present as all Muslims are terrorists, and it can present as Muslims are criminals. So depending on what's happened, it could be either or. And this is an example of that sort of language and imagery. And then we have content just directly inciting violence. Okay, the Hamas-Iran war with Israel is spread worldwide, especially in the US and Canada, force deport Muslims at gunpoint. Okay, the anti-Semitism, 27 categories. We're not going to look at all of them. You can see again the different levels, different platforms having different levels of problem. The graph at the top is across all platforms how much of the anti-Semitism fits into each of those categories. What's really interesting here, for all the debate about definitions of anti-Semitism, the vast majority of the anti-Semitism is in the middle, category 3, Category 3 is that traditional anti-Semitism I spoke about before. Okay, it's anti-Semitism that has absolutely nothing to do with Israel. Okay, it's Jews control the world, Jews killed Jesus, that sort of content. The Israel-related stuff is in category 4. About half of the Israel-related stuff is in category or subcategory 4.4. 4.4 is literally category 3, any of the subcategories in 3, but instead of saying Jews, it says Israel, Israeli, or Zionist. It's not anti-Semitic because it says Israel, Israeli, or Zionist. It's anti-Semitic because it's using those tropes that come from category 3. So what this says is the discussion about anti-Semitism and it's all about Israel, and it's, according to the data, that argument is, whether you believe it or not, is talking about a tiny, tiny percent of the problem. And if that's where the conversation about dealing with anti-Semitism ends up, it becomes just a deflection to dealing with the vast majority of the problem that most people would agree on, right? And that any political differences are actually irrelevant to. Again, just to show you an example of differences between platforms, this is that same breakdown by category, but now just showing you TikTok and LinkedIn. And category 4.5, comparing Israeli policies to Nazi policies or Nazism. LinkedIn, there is a lot of that. TikTok, there's none of it. So this is just showing you again that depending on what platform you're on, the nature of the hate changes, just as we saw with Islamophobia. So if we want to tackle the problem, we really need the data, and then we need specific responses that are tailored to the platform. Again, examples, inciting violence against Jews. It says, this is the ideal Jewish body holding up a pile of ash. Jews must be on a lead at all times. Conspiracy theories. This one's a Holocaust denial one. This is one of the examples that's using anti-Semitic words or imagery. This sort of Jews controlling the world, and you can see the meme of the happy merchant in the corner there. This is the sort of imagery that originally we see in some of the Nazi artwork. Okay, how long have I got?
We have about 5 minutes.
Okay, I will be very, very quick. Just to give you the latest data here. So firstly, we have a report that's just come out on the Bondi attack. I'm giving a talk on it tonight, so if anyone would like to come, you're most welcome. I don't know, if you want to take a picture, just make a note of details. Okay, I'll give you a second. Got it. So we gathered 653 items of online content. 515 of them were anti-Semitic. That number's actually wrong. I've just rechecked the data. It's 11% were Islamophobic. Some of the items were both anti-Semitic and Islamophobic. Okay, some of the Islamophobic items were Islamophobic and xenophobic, and then there were xenophobic items that were purely xenophobic, that didn't mention Muslims at all. So it's a combination of these different issues. A very large part of that data, a very large part of that data was actually saying that the attack either didn't happen at all, that it was fake with crisis actors, like we've seen with school shootings in the US, or it was real, but it was being done by the Jews in order to get sympathy or something, or it was being done by Israel in order to, whatever. There's 15 people that are dead. The people that killed them, they had ISIS flags in their vehicle. They had a video on their phone. It's very clearly ISIS inspired, at least. We did another data collection. We looked at posts made by high-profile people from each community or community organisations, and we looked at all the comments they were getting when their posts were going viral. And what we found was that, firstly, the difference between the anti-Semitism on Jewish posts and the Islamophobia on Muslim posts was in the order of 1 or 2 items. Like, it was almost exactly identical. That's the 2 parallel lines you can see. What you can see in red is our monitoring over the last 2 years of the level of anti-Semitism. This is how many anti-Semitic comments we would find on an anti-Semitic post. So the post is anti-Semitic, it attracts further anti-Semitic comments, and we have a density function there. What this is showing is that the level of anti-Semitism on a post from a Jewish or Muslim person was now getting as many anti-Semitic comments as an anti-Semitic post that was inviting anti-Semitism has been getting for the last 2 years. Right? That's what you're seeing at the top there. What you can see in the light green and light blue is the number of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic comments on what we call neutral posts. So these are posts by the Prime Minister, by the government, by MPs, by media organisations. The density of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on those posts was also very high. In fact, the anti-Semitism was exactly the same level as what we were seeing on anti-Semitic posts prior to October 7. So it's gone from being, this is how many we have if you're asking for anti-Semitism, to this is just normal on whatever it is. The Islamophobia is, I think it's 75% of the anti-Semitism. So again, that's showing a significant rise, but that is a drop from what we saw in the 3-month sample we saw previously. Okay, but it is a rise from the baseline still. Some of the online hate, right? This is content saying, oh, it's the Jews behind the attack that killed 15 people at a Jewish celebration. This is some of the content because the attacker, 2 attackers were Muslim, ISIS-linked comments saying, well, all Muslims are like this. So this is content we were gathering in real time from 15 minutes after the shooting stopped. I'm not sure I have time to go through this, but this is a post from a few months after October 7, which misrepresents international law. It correctly quotes a UN General Assembly resolution, that's the bit in light blue, but as you'll know, UN General Assembly resolutions actually don't make international law, right? Only the Security Council does that. But then it's summarised in the dark blue, saying all forms of resistance against a military occupation are legal under international law. Even if the bottom one was law, the top one would not be true. Because when you say all forms, you're saying terrorism, crimes against humanity, genocide, all sorts of war crimes, and that's just not true, right? The Geneva Conventions do not get suspended. The reason I'm showing this now is because then we have this. The first one was justifying October 7 and trying to say it was legal. This one is now justifying the Bondi attack, killing Jewish civilians in Australia. And it's the same sort of logic, only now it claims there's a revised Geneva Conventions. And they say attacking, I'll just read it, Australia arms Israel, the revised Geneva Convention authorises reprisal attacks by genocided people. This is due to genocidal actions of Israel and their sponsor, Australia, alone. The attack on Bondi Beach was legal to anyone who supports basic human rights for Muslims. Right? This is highly problematic from 2 directions. Okay, firstly, because people that don't understand law, who might be on a path to radicalisation from within the Muslim community, might see this as saying, yes, this is okay. On the other hand, people looking at this might say, well, this is what the Muslim community is saying, therefore, go back to all the Islamophobia we just saw. We need to get Muslims out the country, Muslims are terrorists, etc. So this sort of comment can have both directions causing problems. And I think that was the last slide. Thank you. Thank you all. there's 2 bonus slides here, just one here from a year ago. Mark Zuckerberg said 1 to 2 out of every 10 things they were removing should probably not have been removed. So they were going to tone down their moderation and remove the automated moderation for hate speech. This is their transparency report. Because 1 or 2 out of 10 were being wrongly removed, now 7 to 8 out of 10 are not being removed at all. That's where we are today. And that's again why the law needs to intervene and we need to have regulation, because left to their own devices, it's not in the platform's business interest to actually deal with this problem. It only becomes viable when there's a regulatory framework that makes it more painful to allow the problem to persist, than to address it. And that only happens if there are fines and penalties that come into play if you don't deal with it. So that's the real end. Thank you.